My name is Emily. I wake up every day to the insistent sound of my alarm clock, which seems to be the only constant in my life. The noise always jolts me from the same dream. I'm in an unknown place, surrounded by unfamiliar people, but I feel like, finally, I belong somewhere. But when I open my eyes, I find myself in the same silent room, surrounded by the same white walls that have witnessed the routine that has been repeated for years. My job as an administrative assistant isn't exactly what I envisioned for myself when I was younger. Every day is the same faces, the same mechanical tasks, the same schedules. I try to convince myself that I'm okay, that this is normal. But deep down, I feel an emptiness that only seems to grow over time. Sometimes I wonder if this is how life is supposed to be, if everyone lives in a constant repetition of colorless days. I have friends, of course, but over time, going out has started to feel more like an obligation than a pleasure. Every gathering is a repetition of the same conversations, the same dramas, and the same unfunny jokes. I smile. But the truth is that at the end of each night, I go home feeling more alone than when I left. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for. Maybe it's something new, an emotion that will pull me out of this rut. Maybe it's someone who will make me feel alive again, who will bring color to my gray days. I catch myself fantasizing about it during the long, tedious hours in the office, imagining that somewhere out there, there is a more vibrant life waiting for me. As I look out of the window of my apartment, watching the city lights blinking in the distance, I can't help but wish for a change. Anything that can break this suffocating routine. I just want to feel like I'm really living and not just existing. Something inside me is crying out for more, for a connection, for something that will finally make my heart race. I just didn't imagine that in searching for this emotion, I would be opening the door to something that would change my life forever. And maybe, just maybe, I should have been more careful about what I wished for. It was a night I wasn't expecting much from. I went to the social event more at the insistence of my coworkers than out of my own will. The music was loud. The colored lights were flashing around, and I was standing in a corner, holding a glass of wine that I had barely touched. I felt out of place, as always. Amidst the crowd of familiar and unfamiliar faces, I just wanted to find an excuse to leave. That's when he appeared. A man who seemed to come out of nowhere, with a confident smile and a gaze that conveyed an almost hypnotic calm. His deep blue eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything around seemed to disappear. He introduced himself as Ethan, and from the first moment, I felt an inexplicable connection, as if I had known him for a long time. He was charming in a way I had never experienced before. His voice was soft, almost like a melody I wanted to hear over and over again. I don't know how, but in a few minutes of conversation, he seemed to have uncovered my deepest thoughts. He made me laugh, something I hadn't done genuinely in a long time. Every word he said, every gesture, made me feel more comfortable and more involved. As we talked, he looked at me in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in that crowded room. It was as if he were completely focused on me, on my desires, on my insecurities. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone really saw me, that someone cared. He was attentive, always listening more than talking, but his words, when they came, were always kind and caring. I found myself thinking about how strange it was that a stranger could make me feel so good, so quickly. Every minute with him made me want to stay there longer, despite my initial desire to run away from that place. Ethan had an aura of security around him. There was something about him that made me feel protected, as if nothing bad could happen to me while I was by his side. It was a new and welcoming feeling, something I didn't want to lose. When he suggested we go somewhere quieter, where we could talk better, I didn't hesitate. I wanted to know him better. I wanted to understand what was behind those intense eyes and that enigmatic smile. At that moment, I had no idea that I was about to enter something much bigger than I could imagine. Ethan seemed to be everything I had always wanted, and on that first encounter, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, my desire for something more in life was finally becoming a reality. After that night, things between Ethan and I progressed at a speed I had never experienced before. We started seeing each other almost every day, as if it were natural, as if we had been together for years. He was unlike anyone I had ever met, always available, always attentive, always concerned with making me happy. I felt special beside him, as if I had finally found someone who really understood me. In the early days, everything seemed like a dream. Ethan was the kind of man every woman would want by her side. He knew exactly what to say and when to say it, and he was always there to listen, to support me. His good morning messages, his invitations to unexpected dinners, and the gifts that appeared for no apparent reason made me believe I was living a fairy tale. But as time went by, I began to notice some things that made me a little uncomfortable, although I didn't want to admit it. It all started with small comments that, at the time, seemed harmless. "Are you really going out in that outfit?" he would ask with a gentle smile, but there was something in his tone that made me reconsider my choices. "I just want you to look beautiful, so that no one will look at you the wrong way," he would say. And I would end up changing my clothes, thinking he was just looking out for me. Then came the questions about my friends. "Why do you need to go out with them?" he would ask, as if he were genuinely concerned for my safety. "Don't you prefer to stay with me? I miss you so much when you're with them." I had never thought of my friends as a threat to our relationship, but Ethan's words made me feel guilty for wanting to spend time with them. Sometimes, he seemed annoyed when I didn't answer his messages immediately. "I just get worried," he would say, with that look that mixed genuine concern with something I couldn't identify. "What if something happened to you? I couldn't bear to lose you." At first, these displays of jealousy were almost flattering. I had never had anyone so worried about me, someone who seemed to value me so much. But as the days went by, these small concerns began to become more frequent. He wanted to know who I was talking to, where I was going, what I was doing at all times. "It's just because I love you," he would say. And I, without realizing it, would start to adapt my life to avoid any situation that might upset him. I started canceling appointments, stopped talking to some people, all to maintain harmony between us. Deep down, I knew something was changing, but I wanted so much to believe that he really cared, that these small signs were just demonstrations of a deep love, that I ended up ignoring the discomfort that was growing inside me. After all, who wouldn't want to have someone who cares so much? And so, without realizing it, I let myself get more and more involved, convinced that it was all just love, not knowing that I was about to discover the darker side of that feeling. Things began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly, like dark clouds slowly approaching, hiding the sun. Ethan was still the caring and attentive man I had met, but there were moments when something seemed out of place. It all started with small coincidences. One day, I was having coffee at a cafe near work, a place I used to go to relax and read a little. I had never mentioned that place to Ethan, so I was surprised when I saw him walk in, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He smiled when he saw me, saying he was in the area and thought he'd surprise me. At the time, I thought it was adorable, a sweet gesture. But later, when I was alone, I couldn't help but wonder how he knew I would be there at that exact moment. This began to happen more frequently. He would show up in places where I was without me having mentioned my plans. In the park where I went for my morning walks, in the bookstore I visited to escape reality, even at the supermarket, always with a ready excuse, something to justify his presence. "I missed you," he would say, as if that explained everything. And somehow, I accepted it. Another thing that started to bother me was how much he seemed to want to know every detail of my day. At first, I thought it was just genuine interest, but I soon realized that his questions were becoming more specific, more intrusive. "Who did you have lunch with today? Did you talk to anyone new? What did you and your friend talk about on the phone?" He wanted to know everything, every little detail, as if he needed to control every part of my life. One day, when I mentioned that I was going to meet an old college friend, he became visibly uncomfortable. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, with a slight tension in his voice. I hadn't thought it was anything important, just a casual meeting, but he insisted on knowing more. "Did you talk about me?" He seemed obsessed with the idea that I might be hiding something from him. These moments left me with a slight unease, a feeling that something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe there was anything wrong. Ethan still treated me with so much affection and attention, still made me feel special, and I didn't want to ruin that. I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that it was just his way of showing he cared. But deep down, that feeling that something was wrong kept growing, like a seed planted in fertile soil. I ignored these feelings, telling myself they were just coincidences, that he just wanted to be closer to me. However, every time he showed up unexpectedly or asked another intrusive question, that seed took root a little more, making me question what was really going on. I didn't know it at the time, but these small red flags were just the beginning of something much darker that was to come. Our relationship was evolving, or at least that's what I thought. Ethan was increasingly present in my life, and at first, this seemed like a dream. He was so attentive, so involved in everything I did. But gradually, I began to realize that his attention was turning into something more suffocating. It all started with small gestures that, on the surface, seemed full of affection. Ethan loved to help me choose what to wear. "You look so beautiful in blue," he would say with that charming smile. And without realizing it, I began to let him choose more and more of my clothes. At first, it seemed harmless, even sweet. He made me feel like he was taking care of me, that he wanted me to always look beautiful. But over time, I realized that when I chose something different, he always had an opinion. "I don't think that dress is appropriate for dinner tonight," he would say. And before I knew it, I was changing my clothes, trying to please him. His advice didn't stop there. He started questioning my friendships, something I initially interpreted as genuine concern. "Do you really trust that person?" he would ask, with that look that seemed to penetrate my soul. "I just don't want anyone to hurt you." And so, he began to suggest that I distance myself from certain people. First, it was those friends I didn't see as often. Then, even the closest ones. "They don't seem to be good for you, Emily," he would say. And I, without realizing it, started following his suggestions, distancing myself, isolating myself more and more. There was always a reason, a justification that made everything seem logical, even sensible. "I just want the best for you," he would repeat, almost like a mantra. And in my mind, it made sense. I was convinced that he cared about me more than anyone else. He wanted to protect me, take care of me, and who wouldn't want that in a relationship? However, This protection started to feel more like a prison. He wanted to know everything I did, where I went, who I talked to, just to make sure you're okay, he always said. But the questions seemed never-ending. I began to feel monitored, as if my every move was being evaluated. But every time I tried to express my discomfort, he would look at me with those eyes full of concern. "You're being paranoid, honey. I just want to take care of you." It was difficult to argue against that. He always managed to make me feel like I was being ungrateful, that I was rejecting the love he offered me. And I, desperate to maintain harmony, would end up giving in, letting him control more and more aspects of my life. But the more I gave in, the more he seemed to want. And yet, I couldn't see the extent of what was happening. In my mind, I was just trying to maintain my relationship, trying to live up to the love he showed me so intensely. I couldn't realize that with each passing day, I was losing a little more of myself. This concern of his, which initially made me feel protected, was now beginning to suffocate me. But I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself. I kept telling myself that this was what true love should be, that he just wanted the best for me. And so, without realizing it, I was letting myself be controlled, more and more trapped in the web he was weaving around me, disguised as affection and protection. As time went on, I began to notice that my conversations with Ethan increasingly focused on the people around me. He always seemed to have something to say about my friends, my family, anyone who had been part of my life before him. At first, I thought he was just trying to understand me better, but it soon became clear that he had other intentions. "They don't know you like I do," he would say. His voice soft, almost a whisper. "They don't understand what you need, Emily. Only I know what's best for you." At first, I didn't take it too seriously. After all, he was right in some ways. Ethan was the one who was with me every day, who knew my anxieties, my insecurities. But gradually, his words started to make more sense. Or at least, that's what I thought. I began to notice the small criticisms here and there. "Your friend Clara, she seems so negative. Have you noticed how you always feel sad after talking to her?" And suddenly, I found myself avoiding Clara's calls, replying to her messages less and less, until our meetings became rare and filled with uncomfortable silences. With my family, the situation was even more difficult. I had always been very close to my mother, and she noticed the changes in me from the beginning. "Are you okay, dear?" she would ask, with that concern only a mother has. But when I mentioned this to Ethan, he would look at me with a mix of concern and sadness. "She just doesn't understand how much we love each other, Emily. Maybe she's afraid of losing you, but she doesn't realize that we're happier together. She wants to control you, just like she always has." Those words hurt me, but somehow I began to believe them. I found myself avoiding my mother's calls, making excuses not to visit her on the weekends. When we did see each other, there was a distance between us that I couldn't explain. I knew she felt it too, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything to change it. Ethan was subtle, but effective. He never directly told me to cut ties with anyone, but his suggestions and comments planted doubts in my mind, doubts that turned into decisions. "Why do you need to talk to your brother so much? He's never really been there for you." And so my conversations with my brother dwindled, almost disappearing. I felt increasingly isolated, but every time I felt lonely, there was Ethan, ready to comfort me, to remind me that he was all I needed. "I'm here for you," he would say. "I really understand you, unlike them." And I, wanting so much to believe that he was the only one who truly knew me, began to distance myself from everyone else, convinced that no one else could give me what he did. Gradually, I closed myself off in a world where only Ethan and I existed. My friends, my family, they all seemed so distant, almost unreal. And as my life became more and more centered around Ethan, I didn't realize that I was losing the people who really loved me, trading reality for an illusion he had carefully constructed. It was an invisible prison, a web of control and manipulation that enveloped me more and more. And even as I felt the loneliness growing inside me, I convinced myself that everything was fine, that Ethan was all I needed. After all, he was always there, ready to tell me what I wanted to hear, to pull me further away from the real world and trap me in the bubble he had created for me. Things between Ethan and me were getting more and more intense, but I started noticing that the line between care and control was becoming increasingly blurred. It began subtly, as many things did with him. One day, we were in my apartment, watching a movie, when he casually asked to use my phone. "My battery died," he said, with that smile that always disarmed me. I didn't think twice and handed him the device. At that moment, I didn't notice anything wrong. But a few days later, while we were having dinner, he mentioned something I knew I had never told him about. It was a conversation I had had with a coworker via text. I was surprised, but he, with his usual calmness, said he had read it by accident when he was using my phone. "I just wanted to know you better, Emily," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't mind, do you? I'm your boyfriend, after all." That bothered me, but I ended up ignoring the feeling, trying to justify to myself that he was just being curious. But that curiosity began to turn into something more invasive. I started noticing that he knew things I had never told him, intimate details of conversations I had with friends and family. One day, I picked up my phone and realized that some messages had already been read, even though I was sure I hadn't opened them. When I confronted him, he just smiled and said, "I just wanted to see if you were okay. I care about you so much, Emily. I don't want anyone to hurt you." Even so, I couldn't avoid the discomfort that was growing inside me. I started to feel like I no longer had any privacy, that every aspect of my life was under Ethan's control. One night, while he was in the shower, I decided to check my email, something I did regularly. Upon opening it, I noticed that there were several emails marked as read, messages I hadn't seen before. Shock took hold of me. He was invading even my emails. When I confronted him, my voice trembled. "Ethan, are you reading my emails? That's not right." He stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, and looked at me with an expression of pure tranquility. "Emily, I do this because I care about you. I would never do anything to hurt you. What if someone was deceiving you? What if you were in danger? I just want to protect you." The way he spoke made everything seem so logical, so full of love. But inside me, I felt increasingly invaded, as if he were dismantling every piece of my life and taking ownership of it. But every time I tried to express my discomfort, he managed to reverse the situation, making me feel like I was being irrational, that my concern was unnecessary. "If you have nothing to hide, why care?" he would ask. And I, unable to find an answer that wouldn't make me seem guilty, would end up backing down. My life was no longer my own, but I couldn't see a way out. Ethan was in every aspect of my existence, and even feeling that something was terribly wrong, I found myself trapped, powerless to confront him truly. I convinced myself that it was just his way of loving me, but at the same time, a part of me screamed for freedom, wanting to regain control over who I was. Things started to take a strange turn. It was as if Ethan knew my every move, every decision I made. even those I had never shared with him. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, that maybe I had mentioned something and simply forgotten. But over time, these coincidences started to accumulate in a way I could no longer ignore. One day, after work, I decided to stop at a new coffee shop that had opened near my office. I had never mentioned this place to anyone, not even Ethan. It was just a little moment I wanted for myself, a time to relax and think. I was sitting at a table in the corner, drinking coffee and reading a book, when suddenly Ethan walked through the door. My heart stopped for a second. He saw me and came straight over, smiling as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "What a coincidence to see you here," he said, sitting down next to me and ordering a coffee. I smiled back, but my mind was racing. How did he know I would be there? I tried not to think too much about it, but the idea that he might be following me began to settle in my mind. Another day, I decided to go to the park for a walk, something I didn't do regularly. As I was walking, enjoying the silence and fresh air, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and, to my surprise, there was Ethan running towards me with a smile on his face. "I thought I'd keep you company," he said breathlessly. I forced a smile, but my discomfort was palpable. I had never told him I was going to the park, nor had I even mentioned that I liked walking in that particular place. These casual encounters started happening with an alarming frequency. Wherever I went, he would show up, always with a ready explanation, always saying it was a coincidence or that he was just passing by. Every time this happened, my mind became more disturbed. I started to avoid making plans, to go out without telling anyone, but somehow, Ethan always seemed to know where to find me. One night, when I was at home, I decided to test him. I went out to a convenience store in my neighborhood, a place I rarely visited, and didn't tell anyone. As I was choosing some items on the shelf, I heard someone approaching. My stomach knotted when I heard Ethan's voice behind me. "Need anything?" he asked, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for him to be there. My heart raced. I knew I hadn't told him where I was going, and there was no way he could know. At that moment, the suspicion that had been growing inside me solidified. He was following me. But even so, I didn't know how to react. I confronted him, but he just smiled, saying he was worried about me, that he wanted to make sure I was safe. I went home that night with a heavy feeling in my chest, as if the world around me was closing in. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. The idea that the person who claimed to love me, who promised to protect me, was in fact stalking me, monitoring me, was too terrifying to process. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the signs. Something was terribly wrong, and I could no longer ignore it. I started to feel trapped, watched, all the time. Every step I took, every decision I made seemed to be monitored by Ethan. And although I wanted to believe he was just being protective, the truth was that I was starting to feel scared. Afraid of being with him, afraid of being without him, afraid that my life would no longer be my own. And as these suspicions grew, I knew I was approaching a point of no return. After that night at the convenience store, my life began to transform into an endless sequence of disturbing coincidences. Ethan seemed to be everywhere I was, always with a smile, always with a ready explanation. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was exaggerating, that it was just the result of our routines overlapping. But as time passed, this feeling of discomfort began to transform into something much more intense: paranoia. No matter where I went, it seemed like Ethan was there. If I decided to have lunch somewhere different from usual, he would appear out of nowhere, as if he were just passing by. If I changed my walking route or decided to go to a store I rarely visited, he would show up, always with the excuse that he missed me and wanted to surprise me. But these surprises started to make me anxious, with a constant feeling of being watched. Things got to the point where I could no longer relax. Every time I left the house, I felt like someone was following me. I would look over my shoulder, searching for that familiar gaze, expecting to see him appear at any moment. And most of the time, he did. In a market, in a cafe, even in a bookstore where I used to go to find some peace. He was always there, like a shadow, reminding me that I was never truly alone. I started having difficulty sleeping. Every noise in my house, every movement outside my window made me jump in fear. I imagined Ethan outside, watching, waiting for an opportunity to approach. What was once just a suspicion now became a terrifying certainty. He was watching me. My attempts to confront him were useless. "You're being silly, Emily," he would say, with that calmness that made my words seem irrational. "I just want to be close to you. Is that so wrong?" But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I could no longer distinguish what was real from what was my imagination. Every time he appeared, I felt panic rise up my spine. And even when he wasn't around, the feeling of being watched never left me. I started to isolate myself even more, avoiding leaving the house, avoiding talking to anyone. The fear that Ethan might be anywhere consumed me, and the worst part was that I had no concrete proof, nothing I could use to convince myself or others that I wasn't losing my mind. My nights were the worst. Every shadow, every noise seemed like confirmation that I was being watched. I started locking all the doors and windows, checking them several times before trying to sleep. Even so, sleep never came easily. I would lie in the darkness, listening, waiting, dreading the moment he would appear again, unannounced, as he always did. Paranoia was consuming me, and I no longer knew who to trust, not even myself. I wanted to believe that I was safe, that I was just overreacting, but each new coincidence made that hope crumble a little more. I was on the edge of the abyss, feeling like at any moment I could completely lose control of my life. And as the paranoia increased, a dark certainty took hold of me. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. The paranoia was becoming unbearable. Every time Ethan showed up unexpectedly, every time he seemed to know things I'd never told him, I felt the panic growing inside me. I knew something was wrong, that he was doing more than just protecting me. But it wasn't until I found the evidence that everything came crashing down. It happened in a moment of carelessness. One of those rare moments when Ethan wasn't by my side. He had left his phone on the table while he went to the bathroom. Normally, I would never have touched his things, but something inside me, perhaps my growing distrust, made me pick up the device. I didn't intend to snoop, but a notification that popped up on the screen caught my attention. It was a message from an app I had never seen before. With my heart pounding, I opened the message, and what I found made me feel like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. There, on the screen, were photos of me, taken without my knowledge. Photos of me walking to work, leaving my house, sitting in cafes, all taken from a distance, as if I were prey being hunted. There was a sequence of images that showed my daily routine, every step documented with terrifying precision. The dates and times were all there, as if he had kept a meticulous record of my every move, but the photos were just the beginning. As I continued to explore, I found a series of detailed notes about my activities, what time I left the house, where I went, who I talked to. He knew everything. Every little detail of my life was recorded there, as if he were planning every casual encounter, every surprise appearance. My body began to tremble as I read those words, seeing my entire life unfold before me, controlled, manipulated. He had been monitoring me, following me, recording everything, as if I were an object, a possession of his. The messages were exchanged between him and someone who seemed to provide information or help him track my movements, but the details about this person were hidden. When Ethan returned from the bathroom, I was in a state of shock. He noticed the phone in my hand and the expression on my face, and his smile instantly vanished. "Emily, what are you doing?" he asked. But the usual calmness in his voice had disappeared, replaced by a tension I had never heard before. I stood up, still trembling, holding the phone as if it were a weapon. "What is this, Ethan? Why are you doing this to me?" My voice was filled with fear and disbelief. He tried to approach me, but I took a step back, my eyes fixed on his. "I did this to protect you, Emily," he said, but there was a coldness in his words, something calculated. "You never know who might be watching you. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." Those words, which had once brought me comfort, now filled me with disgust. The truth was as clear as day. Ethan had been stalking me, controlling me, turning my life into a prison, and I had no idea what he would be capable of doing next. I didn't wait to find out. I dropped the phone to the floor and ran out, without looking back. My heart was racing and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and despair. I knew I wasn't safe, not as long as he knew my every move. All I wanted was to escape, to flee the nightmare my life had become. But as I ran away, a new realization hit me hard. I no longer had control over my own life. Ethan had taken that away from me, and now I needed to find a way to get it back, before it was too late. After discovering the evidence on Ethan's phone, I could no longer ignore what was happening. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photos, the messages, the meticulous notes about my movements. It was as if everything I thought was real was crumbling. I knew I needed to confront him. I needed answers, even though I feared what would come next. The next day, I decided to face Ethan. The previous night had been a torment, my mind spiraling in fear and confusion. I needed to know why he was doing this, what he really wanted from me. When he arrived at my house, his usual smile seemed forced, as if he could sense the tension in the air. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He looked at me with a hint of concern, but there was something in his eyes that told me he knew what was coming. "About what, Emily?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the discomfort in his posture. "About this," I said, showing him the phone I still held, with the messages and photos I had found. "I saw everything, Ethan. The photos, the records. Why are you following me? Why are you monitoring me?" For a moment, he was silent, his eyes fixed on mine. I could see his mind working, trying to find the best way to react. Then, as if something clicked inside him, his expression shifted to one of disbelief, almost sadness. "Emily, I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tinged with a defensive tone. "You must be imagining things. Maybe you misunderstood." My anger began to rise. "Misunderstood? Ethan, I saw the photos. I saw the notes about every move I made. How can you say I'm imagining things?" He shook his head, taking a step toward me, but I backed away. "Emily, listen, you're tired, stressed. I know things have been hard for you, but those things you found, maybe they belong to someone else. It could be a coincidence. I would never do something like that." His voice was so convincing, so calm, that for a brief second, I almost believed him. I almost thought that maybe I was really overreacting, that maybe it was all just a big misunderstanding. But then, the memories of sleepless nights, of the moments when he appeared out of nowhere, of the constant feeling of being watched, came back in full force. "No," I said more firmly, "it's not a coincidence. It's not my imagination." "You're following me, Ethan. You know things I never told you. You invaded my privacy, and that's not normal." He sighed deeply, and his expression shifted again, this time to something darker. "Emily, you're being paranoid. You're letting your insecurities take over. I just wanted to protect you, but now you're accusing me of something I didn't do. That's not fair." His words cut through me like a knife. He was trying to turn everything around, trying to make me doubt myself like he always did. I felt anger mixed with pain rising within me. "Don't try to manipulate me, Ethan. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I know what you're doing." He took another step toward me, and this time I didn't back down. "Emily, please, you know I love you. I would never do anything to hurt you. Everything I did was out of love. Maybe you're feeling insecure, but I'm here for you. There's no need to create ghosts where there aren't any." His words, spoken so softly, were poison to my mind. I wanted to scream, wanted to make him admit what he was doing, but he was so good at twisting reality, at making me feel guilty for doubting him. The confrontation was going exactly as he wanted it, and I felt my strength slipping away, my sense of reality beginning to disintegrate. I just want to understand." My voice finally wavered, full of uncertainty and pain. Ethan gently placed his hand on my shoulder, and for a moment, the familiarity of that gesture made me shiver. "I know, Emily. I know you want to understand, but sometimes our minds play tricks on us. Let's forget this, okay? Let's go back to how we were before. I'm here for you. I always will be." I stood there, motionless, trying to process everything, trying to hold on to what was left of my sanity. He was denying everything, turning the blame on me as if I were the crazy one for being suspicious. And deep down, I knew he was managing to manipulate me once again, plunging my mind into chaos from which I didn't know how to escape. I wanted so badly to believe he was telling the truth, but a small voice inside me screamed that I needed to get away before he completely destroyed my reality. After the confrontation with Ethan, something inside me broke. I knew he was manipulating me. I knew what was happening wasn't normal, but the doubt he planted in my mind was like a poison that spread slowly, making me question everything. And worst of all, I felt like I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. In the days that followed, I began to withdraw from everything and everyone. The fear that no one would believe me mingled with the dread that Ethan would do something even worse if I tried to seek help. After all, he had already invaded my life in ways I never thought possible. Who knew what else he was capable of? The idea of exposing what was happening to someone seemed more dangerous than continuing alone, trapped in my own silence. I stopped answering calls from my friends and family. Messages piled up on my phone, but I didn't have the energy to respond. Every ring of the phone, every notification filled me with dread, as if at any moment Ethan could be on the other end, waiting to entangle me in another one of his lies. Even leaving the house became a terrifying task. I avoided public places, avoided being seen, as if every step I took was being monitored, judged. My world shrank until it became just the four walls of my apartment, where I felt minimally safe, but still, never completely. I started to distrust everything: the noises at the door, the shadows that moved in the windows, even the people who passed by on the street. Every little detail seemed like a sign that Ethan was there, watching. waiting for the right moment to reappear. The isolation was crushing, a prison I had built myself, but one I couldn't escape. The loneliness was thick, suffocating, but the fear of leaving the cocoon I had created was even greater. I was afraid to open up, to share what was happening with anyone. Ethan's voice still echoed in my mind, saying that no one would understand, that everyone would think I was exaggerating, that I was crazy. What if he was right? What if, by trying to seek help, I would only end up exposing myself more, giving him more control over my life? The few times I considered asking for help, doubt paralyzed me. How could I explain to someone what was happening without sounding irrational? How could I prove that the coincidences, the invasions of privacy, the manipulations were real? Ethan had been so careful, so meticulous in isolating me that even I was starting to question my sanity. Each day that passed, I shrank further into myself, fearing that any movement could trigger something even worse. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. My mind was divided between paralyzing fear and the desperate need to escape. But deep down, I knew I was completely alone in this fight, and that terrified me more than anything. As the days dragged on, isolation became my only companion. I felt trapped, not just physically, but mentally, as if my own thoughts and ideas were slowly being corroded. And it was then that Ethan began to play a new game, a cruel and manipulative game that made me question everything, including my own sanity. He knew exactly how to infiltrate my mind. It was subtle, as always. His words were never direct, never an outright accusation or clear statement, but they were like poison, insidious, seeping in slowly until I no longer knew what was real. "Emily, you've been acting so strange lately," he started saying, his voice soft, almost compassionate. "I'm so worried about you. Aren't you seeing things that aren't really there?" At first, I tried to ignore it. I knew he was manipulating me, knew that his words were part of a bigger plan to make me doubt myself. But it was hard not to let the doubt creep in, especially when everything around me seemed increasingly uncertain. His small gestures began to unsettle me. He would move things around in my house, a book out of place, a door left open, and when I questioned it, he would laugh and say I was imagining things. "You must have forgotten, Emily. Are you sure it wasn't you who left it that way?" I knew it wasn't true, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with me. There was one time when I left the house and found my keychain on the floor, with one key missing. I was certain I had left it on the table, intact. When I mentioned it to Ethan, he seemed genuinely concerned. "Emily, you need to rest. You're so stressed that you're starting to forget things. Maybe you left the key somewhere else." These incidents began to multiply. I found things out of place in my apartment, messages on my phone that I didn't remember sending, and always, Ethan was there, ready to help me understand that I was just confused, that my mind was playing tricks on me. He never confronted me directly, but his words and actions planted seeds of doubt that grew day by day. "I love you, Emily. I just want you to be okay. But sometimes, I feel like you're losing yourself in your own head." Every time he said this, I felt a chill, as if he were pushing me toward a precipice from which I couldn't return. I started questioning my own memories, my perception of the world around me. I knew what I had seen, what was happening, but his manipulation was so constant, so careful, that I began to doubt myself. Am I really exaggerating? Am I going crazy? These questions began to dominate my thoughts, consuming me every hour of the day. Ethan seemed to feed on my confusion. The more I questioned my sanity, the closer he seemed to get, as if offering me relief while simultaneously pushing me deeper into uncertainty. "I'm here for you," he would say, his voice gentle but full of something dark. "Don't worry. We'll get through this together. I love you, even if you're like this." The worst part was that sometimes I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he was right, that it was all just a misunderstanding, my own mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that this was exactly what he wanted me to think. He was manipulating me, making me doubt my own reality. And the more I tried to escape from the web he had woven, the more trapped I became. My confidence in myself was slipping away, and I no longer knew whom to trust, or if I could even trust my own thoughts. Ethan was playing with my mind in a way I never imagined possible, and I felt that with each passing day, I was losing another piece of myself. I was on the brink of collapse, and he knew it. He knew that if he kept manipulating me, soon there would be nothing left of who I was, only what he wanted me to become. I reached a point where I couldn't take it anymore. Every day was a battle to maintain my sanity, and I knew that if I continued like this, I would soon lose all control over my life. Ethan's manipulation had pushed me to the brink, and the only solution I could see was to run. I needed to escape his influence before he completely destroyed me. I decided that the only way to regain control of my life was to cut all ties with him. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was my only chance to return to who I was before Ethan entered my life. I spent nights planning, thinking through every detail. I decided I would change my routines, stop going to the places he knew, and even considered moving to a new city where he couldn't find me. I started with small steps. I changed the route I took to work, began going to different cafes at different times. I stopped responding to his messages and started ignoring his calls. I made sure not to leave any clues about where I would be or what I was doing. It was as if I was trying to erase myself from my own life, hoping he wouldn't be able to follow. But Ethan always seemed to be one step ahead. On the first day I changed my route to work, there he was, standing on the corner, as if he knew exactly where I would be. "What a coincidence to see you here," he said with that smile that now made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, trying to hide my panic, but inside, I was falling apart. How did he know? How could he always be where I least expected? I began to change the times I left the house. I decided to wake up earlier, leave before sunrise, hoping to escape his suffocating presence. But somehow, he always seemed to find me. One morning, as I hurried to the bus stop, I heard his footsteps behind me. "Emily, wait for me," he called out, and I felt my heart sink. It was as if he was watching me all the time, anticipating my movements, as if he knew exactly what I would do next. Every new attempt to escape seemed futile. If I went to a new cafe, he would appear minutes later. If I tried changing my schedule, he somehow adjusted his to coincide with mine. It was as if he was everywhere, always there, always present. No matter how hard I tried to get away, I started to feel like a trapped animal with no way out, no hope. Frustration and fear began to mix, creating a deep sense of despair. I knew I needed to cut off all contact with him, but the more I tried, the more he seemed to cling to me. It felt impossible to escape his web, as if he had infiltrated every aspect of my life, leaving me with no safe place to hide. So, I decided to take a more drastic measure. I needed to disappear, at least for a while. I planned a sudden trip to a place where he would never expect to find me. I bought a bus ticket to a small town miles away without telling anyone. I turned off my phone, hoping that by disconnecting from everything, I could finally escape Ethan. But when I arrived at the destination, exhausted and terrified, I found Ethan waiting for me at the bus station, his sinister smile illuminated by the dim light of dawn. "I knew you needed some time," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "So I decided to come with you." My heart sank at that moment. I realized there was no way to escape. Not while he was determined to keep me under his control. Ethan was always one step ahead, always present, as if he could read my mind, as if he knew all my secrets. And it was there, in that small bus station, that reality hit me with full force. I couldn't escape him. No matter how far I ran, he would always be there, following me, watching me, hunting me. And in that moment, despair consumed me in a way I had never experienced before. After the failed attempt to escape, I was on the brink of collapse. More and more, I felt there was no way out, that Ethan was always one step ahead, anticipating my every move as if he were inside my head. But it was in that moment of complete despair that I discovered something even more disturbing, something that made everything I had already endured seem like just the prelude to a much darker nightmare. I was at home, exhausted and emotionally devastated, trying to think of any solution to escape him. I knew I needed to find a way to break free, but the constant feeling of being watched paralyzed me. It was then that, while rummaging through my own house for something I could use to defend myself, I found a small box hidden at the back of one of my bedroom drawers, a drawer I rarely opened. Inside the box, I found a collection of items that made me shudder. There were photos of me, taken at moments when I knew I was alone, in the shower, sleeping, walking down the street. Each photo seemed to capture a moment of vulnerability, times when I never would have imagined I was being watched. But there was more. Along with the photos, I found small objects, an earring I had lost months ago, a scarf that had mysteriously disappeared. Small things I had written off as lost, but there they were, kept like trophies. My breathing grew heavy as I tried to process what I was seeing. How had he gotten these things? How had he taken those photos without me knowing? The answer lay just below the items. A small notebook filled with detailed notes that seemed to chronicle my entire life since Ethan had entered it. I started flipping through the notebook, and horror washed over me as the words took on meaning. Every move I made, every conversation, every interaction I had since meeting Ethan was documented there with terrifying precision. He had been following me from the beginning, orchestrating every coincidence, every unexpected appearance. He knew where I would be, what I would do, because he had planned it all from the start. But what disturbed me the most was discovering that he wasn't acting alone. The notebook contained mentions of a network of people who were helping him, providing information about me, facilitating his control over my life. People I thought were friends, acquaintances, even colleagues, were involved, passing information to Ethan, helping him manipulate me, isolate me. The reality began to spin around me as I absorbed what it all meant. I wasn't just dealing with an obsessive, manipulative man. I was being hunted by a network of people dedicated to monitoring every aspect of my life, controlling me, turning me into something I wasn't. And then, at the back of the notebook, I found a passage that made my blood run cold. There were plans, detailed and meticulous, about what Ethan intended to do with me. He wanted to isolate me from everyone, destroy my sanity, so that I would be completely dependent on him. And once he had broken me, he had even more sinister plans, something he called the final union, where he and I would be together forever, in a way I could never escape. At that moment, the true extent of the danger I was in became clear. Ethan wasn't just an obsessive stalker. He was a meticulous predator who had planned every step to destroy me, to trap me in a life I didn't want, where I would be nothing more than an extension of his will, a reflection of his obsession. The psychological terror I had experienced until now seemed small compared to what I now knew he was capable of. He had been playing with my life from the very beginning, and I had fallen into his trap without realizing how deep I was in. Now, knowing what he really wanted, what he had done to get this far, I knew I had to act. I needed to escape, no matter what it took, before he could complete his plans. But the question that haunted me was, how could I escape someone who always seemed to be one step ahead, from a network that seemed to surround me on all sides? I was more terrified than ever. And in that moment, as I held that notebook in my trembling hands, the reality that I was truly alone with no one to trust settled over me with unbearable weight. Ethan had won every battle so far, but I knew I couldn't let him win the war. I needed to find a way out, and fast, before he could complete his final plan. The notebook was still in my hands when I realized I didn't have much time. The terror that had surged through me as I read those meticulous plans transformed into a desperate determination. I knew Ethan wouldn't stop until he had completely destroyed me, until he had turned me into something I wasn't, something he could control completely. I had to act, and fast. But how? I knew confronting him directly would be useless. Ethan was skilled at manipulating, at twisting situations to make me doubt myself. He had done it so many times before. Confronting him with the notebook, with the evidence, would only give him a chance to disarm me again, to distort reality until I no longer knew what was true. I needed a different strategy, something he couldn't predict. My mind was in turmoil, each thought a mix of fear and an urgent need to survive. I needed to make a decision, something definitive that would get me out of his reach, something he wouldn't expect. The idea came suddenly, like a lightning bolt in the dark. The only way to escape Ethan was to become invisible to him, not physically, but emotionally. I needed to make him believe that he had won, that I had completely surrendered to his influence. The plan began to take shape in my mind. I couldn't run. He was always one step ahead. I couldn't confront him. He always manipulated the situation. But what I could do was make him believe that I was broken, that he had succeeded in breaking my will. If he believed that, maybe he would lower his guard and I would have a chance to escape. I took a deep breath, fighting against the panic threatening to overwhelm me, and prepared my act. When Ethan arrived at my house, I was sitting on the couch, the notebook hidden under a cushion. He entered with that smile that now made my skin crawl, but I forced a smile in return, an empty smile, devoid of any resistance. I had to be convincing. I had to make him believe that I was completely under his control. "You were right, Ethan," I said, my voice low, almost emotionless. I was imagining things. I understand now that you just want to protect me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a gleam of triumph. I always knew you would understand. Emily, I only want what's best for us. I kept my expression vacant, lifeless, as he moved closer to me. Inside, my heart was racing, but I couldn't let him see that. "I know," I murmured. "I just want everything to go back to normal." He sat down beside me, his arm around my shoulders. "It will, Emily. We'll be happy together, like we always should have been." I forced myself to relax, to lean my head against his shoulder, pretending to submit in a way that made me want to scream. But it was the only way. I knew I needed to buy time, to find the right moment to escape. "Can you give me some space?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Just to process all of this? I promise I'm not going anywhere." I could feel his gaze on me, evaluating. trying to decide if he should trust me or not. But I kept up the act, keeping my eyes lowered, my posture submissive. Finally, he nodded. "Of course, Emily. I'll give you some time to think. But remember, I'm here for you." He stood up, and my entire body wanted to collapse in relief, but I forced myself to maintain my composure. He left the house, leaving me alone, but I knew he wouldn't go far. He was always nearby, always watching. I needed to act quickly. As soon as he was gone, I ran to my bedroom, grabbing a small suitcase I had already packed for an emergency. But instead of leaving through the front door, as I had done before, I headed for the bathroom window that opened onto an alley. I needed to be quick and silent before he realized I was no longer there. I climbed out the window, my heart pounding, and started running down the alley, trying to be as quiet as possible. I knew he could be anywhere, but if I could just make it to the end of the alley, maybe I'd have a chance to escape, to finally be free. The alley seemed endless, but I finally reached the end, emerging onto a busy street. The constant flow of people and cars gave me a small sense of relief. I could blend in, disappear into the crowd. Without hesitation, I hailed the first taxi I saw, giving the driver the address of a train station far away. As the taxi drove off, I looked back, expecting to see Ethan running after me, but he wasn't there. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had managed to deceive him, at least for now, but I knew I couldn't stop, couldn't go back. I needed to keep running to get as far away as possible, to a place where he could never find me. And as the taxi sped away, the city fading into the distance, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could finally escape Ethan's shadow. But deep down, I knew the battle wasn't completely won. He would always be searching, always lurking. And I would need to stay one step ahead to avoid being captured again by his web of terror. When the train finally began to move, a wave of relief washed over me. The rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks seemed to slowly carry me away from the nightmare my life had become. But at the same time, a sense of unease settled in my chest, as if a part of me knew that even now, far from Ethan, I would never be the same. I had managed to escape, at least for now. Looking out the window, I watched the landscapes passing by, each mile putting more distance between me and what had almost destroyed me. Yet, the relief I had expected to feel from finally being free didn't come. Instead, I was surrounded by a sense of emptiness, a darkness that followed me no matter where I went. I spent the following hours on the train trying to process everything that had happened, but my mind was confused, unable to detach from what I had been through. Every time someone approached my seat, I flinched, expecting to see Ethan's familiar face, even though I knew he wasn't there. My heart raced at every sudden sound, every movement around me. The paranoia he had planted in me was still alive, like a persistent shadow I couldn't shake off. When I finally arrived at my destination, a small town where no one knew me, I thought I might finally find peace. But even there, far from everything, I couldn't feel safe. Every face in the crowd seemed like a threat, every corner a potential hiding place for Ethan. Even knowing he couldn't have found me so quickly, the thought that he was still searching for me was like a knife lodged in my mind, always present, always painful. I found a small hotel where I could stay for a while, and I locked myself in the room, my heart still pounding, even though I knew I was alone. The silence of the room, which should have been comforting, was oppressive. Every sound, every shadow made me jump, reminding me that no matter how far I went, I wasn't truly free. Ethan had left marks on me that I didn't know if I would ever be able to erase. In the nights that followed, sleep was a rare visitor. I spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, battling the thoughts that haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, the smile that I once found charming, but had now turned into a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in my life. I saw him following me, watching me, always lurking, ready to appear at the moment I least expected. During the day, I tried to move forward, to build a new life, but it was as if the experience had broken me in a way that I couldn't fix. I had become a stranger to myself, someone who lived in fear, who trusted no one, not even her own judgment. I knew that, technically, I was free from Ethan, but he was still there, in my mind, a constant presence I couldn't push away. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that I had managed to escape, but the truth was that freedom felt so fragile, so easily breakable. Every time I heard a step behind me, a phone ring, or an unfamiliar face turn in my direction, the panic returned in full force. I wondered if I would ever truly escape, if I would ever feel genuinely free. I knew that the only way to move forward was to leave the past behind, but how could I do that when it was etched into my mind, like a scar that would never fade? Doubt, insecurity, and fear were my constant companions now, and I didn't know if they would ever leave me. And so, every day, with every step, I asked myself, what if he finds me again? What if this peace I was trying to build was just an illusion? The story didn't seem to have a definitive ending because, deep down, I knew that Ethan's shadow still hung over me. I had escaped physically, but mentally, he still held me captive. And that uncertainty, that sense that danger was still lurking, was the true terror, one that I would carry with me, no matter where I went. In the end, the freedom I had gained was tinged with fear, and the peace I so desperately sought always seemed just out of reach. Even free, I wasn't safe. And deep down, I knew that maybe I never would be. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the distance between me and everything that happened with Ethan began to grow. But despite the passage of time, the emotional scars he left on me remained always lurking, always ready to remind me of the nightmare I lived through. And with those scars came a painful understanding, a reflection I couldn't ignore. I never imagined I could be caught in something so dark, so destructive. When I first met Ethan, he seemed perfect, attentive, caring, concerned for my well-being. But now, looking back, I can see the signs I ignored, the red flags that became evident too late. His jealousy disguised as care, his need for control masked as protection, his love that was, in reality, a form of possession. All these signs were there from the beginning, but I was blind, captivated by the idea of being loved in such an intense way. This experience taught me how dangerous it can be to ignore those signs, how easily love can be turned into a weapon in the hands of someone with dark intentions. What began as an apparently perfect relationship quickly turned into a nightmare of control and manipulation. Ethan didn't just want to love me. He wanted to possess me, to mold me to his will, to isolate me from the world and turn me into something he could completely control. The psychological terror he inflicted on me wasn't immediate, wasn't obvious at first. It was insidious, like a shadow that slowly grows until, by the time I realized it, I was already completely enveloped by it. He made me doubt myself, question my own sanity, to the point where I no longer knew what was real. He isolated me, distanced me from the people who loved me, all under the guise of love and protection. Now, I understand that psychological terror can be just as devastating as any physical violence. It corrodes the mind, destroys trust, and traps the person in a web of fear and uncertainty. It's a type of prison that isn't visible to others, but is terribly real for the one living it. And the worst part is that often it's hard to realize what's happening until it's too late. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's the importance of trusting my instincts, of not ignoring the signs that the body and mind give when something is wrong. Love isn't control, isn't possession, isn't manipulation. Love is freedom, it's respect, it's mutual support, and anything that deviates from that should be seen as a warning sign, a signal that something is deeply wrong. What I lived through with Ethan is something I'll never forget, something that will always be with me in one way or another. But I hope that my story serves as a warning to others, that they never underestimate the power of psychological control, that they never ignore the signs of an abusive relationship. Because just as it happened to me, terror can hide behind a smile, behind sweet words and seemingly caring gestures. And once it sets in, it can be incredibly difficult to escape. Now, I'm rebuilding my life, trying to find the peace I lost. But I know the road won't be easy. The trauma Ethan left in me won't disappear overnight. But I'm determined not to let him continue to control my life, even from afar. I'm learning to trust myself again, to recognize what is healthy and what isn't.